In Washington's North Cascades, a man stepped onto a familiar trail with minimal gear, full confidence, and no reason to worry. Then, weather closed in, the path vanished, and the forest swallowed every marker of direction. What followed wasn't a dramatic accident, but something far more dangerous. Days of hunger, cold, and quiet decisions that slowly erased his way back. Robert Schoch was 39 years old when he parked his car at the Hannigan Pass trailhead in late July of 2024, stepped into the cool morning air, and began a run he expected would be finished before dark. North Cascades National Park carries the highest death rate of any national park in the United States. 3.7 deaths per 100,000 visitors, more than 3 times the rate of the next deadliest site, according to a 15-year federal analysis by NBC News. Most of those who die there are experienced. That detail matters. Schoch was an ultra-marathon runner, by temperament more than by resume. He didn't move through wilderness the way most hikers do, with careful steps and an eye on time. He ran fast when the terrain allowed it, slow when it didn't, covering distance the way some people pace a room. The repetitive violence of footfalls, the rhythm of breath, the narrowing tunnel of attention. Running turned the world quiet. He liked that quiet. It was reliable, even when everything else in his life wasn't. He drifted through the Pacific Northwest in the way certain people do when they have learned to trust motion more than stability. He rented rooms for a few months at a time, then moved on. Sometimes he slept in his car. Sometimes he didn't know where he'd be next week. Music provided an income when it needed to. A guitar, a voice, a few hours under bar lights or on a street corner. It wasn't a glamorous existence. It was simply the one that fit him. His mother, Jan Thompson, would later describe her son as a loner with a warm heart, restless, difficult to pin down, generous in flashes, stubborn in the deep places where stubbornness becomes identity. There was one steady point in Schoch's roaming life, and it trotted beside him at the trailhead that morning. A 5-year-old chocolate Labrador named Freddie. The dog had the thick, athletic-build Labradors get when they're allowed to live outdoors, and the uncritical devotion that makes them both beloved and vulnerable. Freddie ran with Schoch the way he did everything else, fully, unquestioningly. He didn't understand risk. He understood togetherness. Schoch's approach to wilderness travel was minimalist, bordering on contemptuous of the idea that nature required planning. He wasn't a backpacker. He had no interest in a heavy pack, in the slow accumulation of gear that makes many hikers feel safe. His runs were meant to be swift and simple. Start early, cover miles, return by evening. Between 2004 and 2014, across U.S. national parks alone, 46,609 individuals became lost and required search and rescue campaigns, costing a total of $51.4 million, and according to research published in scientific reports, day hikers like Schoch made up 42% of those cases, nearly 4 times the rate of overnight backpackers. He was carrying only what he believed he'd need for a long day of movement. That morning, it amounted to a small backpack with a folding bowl for Freddie and an old paper map with markings from past outings. No food, no spare clothes, no compass, no fire starter. His phone was fully charged, but phones in these mountains are less a tool than a comfort object. The signal disappears not far from the trailhead, swallowed by rock and forest. Schoch rolled the windows of his car down and left his wallet open on the dashboard. His guitar, something he rarely let out of his sight, stayed in the trunk. Anyone who has spent time around missing person cases will recognize this detail for what it is: the accidental evidence of intention. People who expect to return soon leave things the way shock left them. They don't secure valuables. They don't prepare their vehicle. They don't behave as though absence is possible. The first miles unfolded without incident. The trail followed the river through cedar and pine. The air wet with that deep green smell the Cascades produce. Rot and life braided together. Freddie ran ahead, then doubled back, then ran ahead again. The river roared somewhere below, cold and tireless. Around noon, Shock met a young couple hiking down. They exchanged a few words about the weather and the season. The couple continued toward the parking lot. Shock continued upward. They were the last people to see him upright and moving with purpose. Beyond that point, the country shifted. The Washington wildfire season of 2021 produced 1,863 separate fire incidents across the state, burning 647,222 acres. The following year added another 1,492 incidents and 173,659 more acres, according to state DNR records. The fires of those 2 seasons had burned tens of thousands of acres in parts of the North Cascades Range, and the aftermath was not simply black trees and open views. Fire changes everything that follows it. Roots die, soil loosens, trails erode, winter storms topple weakened trunks. What had been a clean corridor of packed dirt becomes a puzzle of fallen timber and new brush. In places, the path vanishes entirely under a tangle of downed logs. Shock had been through this area before, but not since the fires. He noticed the charred stands and ash underfoot, but he did what people often do when they want the day to stay simple. He treated information as background noise. In mid-afternoon, the weather turned. It began with wind on the ridges. Sudden sharp gusts that pushed clouds over the peaks as if someone had drawn a curtain. The sky greyed. Then the rain arrived, cold and heavy, the kind that soaks through fabric quickly and drains warmth from the body with almost clinical efficiency. The North Cascades are infamous for these quick changes. Sunshine in the morning does not promise anything for the afternoon. What matters is not the forecast, but the topography's ability to manufacture its own weather. Shock kept moving. He quickened his pace as if speed could outrun consequences. The trail underfoot became slick. Roots turned to polished hazards. Freddie's ears pinned back and his enthusiasm dulled into quiet obedience. It was in this weather, in this shifting landscape. That shock made the choice that would later look obvious from the outside and feel inevitable from the inside. The path began to disappear amid fallen trees and dense brush. This was the moment to stop, reassess, and turn back while he still had daylight. Instead, Shock pushed forward, reasoning that backtracking meant repeating misery and that forward motion would lead to clearer ground just beyond the next ridge. This logic, common, seductive, and often fatal, is a version of sunk cost. You've already fought through the worst of it, you tell yourself. It would be stupid to give up now. Better to keep going. The trail has to come back. But the trail didn't come back. It had been erased, or rerouted, or destroyed by fire and flood. And Shock continued, searching for it, as though the land owed him continuity. By the time he admitted the truth that the familiar route existed now only in memory, dusk had begun to bleed through the trees. Night in wet forest is not dramatic. It is simply hard. Shock stopped under thick cedar branches and waited, shivering in soaked clothing, trying to keep Freddy close for warmth. He had no fire. He had no dry layer to change into. He had no shelter beyond the indifferent protection of branches. He waited for dawn with the kind of hope people summon when hope is the only thing left that costs nothing. Morning arrived with fog, milky and thick, hanging between trunks like cloth. The sky was a flat grey lid without direction. Shock stood stiff and cold, and tried to orient himself. In open country, you can use the sun. In this forest, the sun is an idea, not a tool. He checked his phone. Overnight cold had drained the battery to the edge of dead. There was no signal anyway. He kept moving, assuming the river would be a guide. Water always seems like a guide. It flows somewhere. Surely it flows toward people. But the ridges here run like a repeated pattern, and it is easy to travel for hours only to find yourself in terrain that looks exactly like where you started. Charred trunks rise like black spikes. Alder bushes knit together in thick walls. You push through them and come out scratched and bleeding, unsure if you've gained anything but fatigue. By the third day, Shock had lost the last of his certainty. He did not simply feel behind schedule. He understood he was truly lost, unlocated in hundreds of thousands of acres of wilderness where maps mean little if you can't identify yourself on them. Research on lost person behavior by Robert Costa, the foundational reference used by SAR teams nationwide, shows that 93% of missing hikers are found within the first 24 hours of a search commencing. After that window closes, the odds compress fast. Shock was already well past it. He shouted into the trees until his throat hurt. He listened to his own voice return as echo and then disappear. No one answered. Panic didn't strike him all at once. It came in waves, separated by stretches of forced reasoning. He tried to follow the survival cliches. Move downhill. Follow water. Conserve energy. But those rules assume you have at least a rough understanding of where you are and where people might be. Shock did not. Freddy stayed close, pressing into him, whimpering softly at times in a way that suggested the dog could sense the shift in their relationship to the world. Animals read fear. They may not name it, but they recognize it. It was on that third day beside the river that Shock made the decision that would later sound like something out of a survival film and feel, in the moment, like a moral injury. He looked at Freddy, wet fur clumped, body trembling, and realized the dog's loyalty was now a threat to both of them. Freddy could not survive weeks of cold nights and long miles without food. Shock also understood, dimly at first, and then with sharpened clarity, that Freddy had a chance he didn't. The ability to navigate by instinct, to find a trail, to find humans. Freddy carried a microchip. Freddy could become a message, but Labradors do not leave their people. Freddy wouldn't run off simply because Shock told him to. So Shock did something cruel with intention. He hugged the dog hard, inhaled the wet animal smell, and then turned himself into a threat. He shouted in a harsh voice. He advanced with a stick and struck the water in front of Freddy's nose, splashing and roaring until fear overtook devotion. Freddy backed away, confused, then finally ran. The dog stopped more than once and looked back. Shock kept shouting until the brown body vanished into green. Then he dropped the stick and sank to his knees. The silence after that effort was immense. He had saved the dog by betraying it. He was now alone in the mountains, in the most complete way a person can be alone, not merely without other humans, but without the one living creature who had shared his days. Freddie traveled roughly 8 miles and reached the main trail along the river the next day. Hikers found him circling, refusing to move on, whining and looking back toward the forest as if the trees contained an answer. The hikers recognized something wrong in the dog's behavior and brought him to the nearest ranger station. A microchip scan produced a name, Robert Schock, with a temporary address in Mount Vernon, Washington. Jan Thompson learned her son was missing in the way parents of drifters often learn such things, by an unexpected phone call in the evening. She had not known he planned to run in the Cascades. The freedom her son insisted upon included freedom from notifying anyone where he was going. On August 5th, sheriff's deputies found Schock's car at the trailhead untouched. The windows were down. The wallet lay open. The guitar sat in the trunk like a quiet accusation. Thompson filed the missing person report that day, and the search began. From the outside, search operations look heroic. Helicopters, teams with dogs, volunteers combing through wilderness. From the inside, search operations are grim logistics and probability. According to National Park Service protocols, standard search efforts run between 7 and 14 days, after which incident commanders weigh survivability statistics against the risk to rescuers, a calculus that grows colder the longer a subject has been missing. The terrain dictates the limits. In the North Cascades, dense canopy blocks thermal imaging. Rivers create dead zones for sound. Steep slopes fracture radio communication. Fog and rain reduce visibility to near nothing. Even when you fly overhead, the forest is a green dome, and a person beneath it is invisible. For 2 weeks, rescuers worked through the logical routes, the places a lost runner might go, the ridges that funnel toward trails, the river corridors. At one point, a ground team passed less than a mile from where Schock was hiding, but the brush was too thick, the river too loud, and Schock's voice too weak. Helicopters flew over the area twice. Schock heard the rotors, saw shadows flicker through gaps in leaves, and screamed until his throat felt torn. No one saw him. The machine's noise moved on. The forest closed again. By August 20th, the official search was suspended. This was not a moral decision, though it felt like one to the family. It was a risk calculation. Continuing to send rescuers into steep, storm-soaked terrain without new information threatened more lives. The odds of finding an adult alive after weeks without food were low enough to sound like cruelty when spoken aloud. Thompson did not accept the conclusion. She called her son every morning, leaving messages on a dead phone, repeating that he was a fighter. The repetition was half prayer, half denial, and entirely human. Meanwhile, Schock was doing what lost people do when they do not have an anchor point. He kept moving. He followed the river downstream because water is at least a line in the chaos. He drank from it constantly, dipping his hands and face into the flow, letting the icy shock keep him alert. The water was murky with glacial silt and cold enough to burn his throat. But dehydration kills quickly, and rivers offer no alternative. Food came in small, unreliable forms, berries by the handful, leaves chewed and spat. One day he found a mushroom, thick and pale at the base of a burned stump, and ate it with the desperate caution of someone gambling with his own poisoning. It did not kill him. It tasted ordinary, almost bland, and the fact that it didn't harm him felt like luck on a scale out of proportion to the event. He tried to make fire. Without a knife, without tinder, without anything dry, fire remained theoretical. He found shelter under fallen trunks and in root hollows that smelled of old animal and damp soil. He slept in shivering fragments. He woke stiff and moved again. Early on, during a river crossing, Shock lost his shoes. The current knocked him off balance. When he scrambled onto the opposite bank, his sneakers had already floated away downstream. Barefoot now, he walked on sharp gravel and cut his feet open. A thorn punctured the big toe of his left foot and became infected. The wound turned red and swollen. Pain narrowed his choices further. Every step became costly. Time lost structure. Days merged into a single long sequence of hunger, cold, and movement. Research from the University of Minnesota's landmark starvation study found that prolonged food deprivation produces significant increases in depression, hysteria, and hypochondria, with most subjects experiencing periods of severe emotional distress, and that study was conducted under controlled conditions, with shelter and hydration secured. He heard voices in the river, words buried in white noise. He caught glimpses of figures between trees. He talked aloud to himself, reciting song lyrics and fragments of conversations, the way isolated minds do when they can't bear total silence. Freddie returned again and again in his mind, a shadow at the edge of vision, a phantom bark. Shock spoke to the dog as if it could hear him. He apologized. He explained. Hunger became a constant physical presence, no longer a sensation that came and went, but an ache that lived inside his ribs. His body began to dismantle itself. Fat reserves vanished. Muscles softened. Skin loosened over bone. Medical data on starvation shows the body can lose 1 to 2 kilograms, roughly 2 to 4 pounds, per day in the earliest days alone, then settling into slower tissue breakdown as muscle is consumed for fuel. His ribs began to show. His joints hurt. Every movement demanded more will than it should have. The river kept roaring beside him, unchanging, indifferent. Sometimes that constancy comforted him. More often it felt like mockery. Nature insisting on continuity while his own body decayed, on what he believed was the 18th or 19th day. Shock attempted another river crossing, lured by berries on the opposite bank. Hunger drives people toward bad trades. The current caught him midstream and slammed him into a granite boulder. The impact knocked the air out of his lungs. He surfaced downstream, coughing and choking, and crawled onto a gravel bar with pain radiating from his heel. Something had failed. An Achilles tendon, already stressed by exhaustion and infection, had inflamed or torn. He tried to stand and see OULDN, single quotes to in the days that followed. Shock's world reduced again from miles to yards. He lay on a narrow gravel shore hidden behind alder thicket. The maintained trail ran less than a mile away, but between trail and river the brush grew thick and tangled, and sound from the water swallowed everything that wasn't loud. Shock could move only by crawling. Dysentery, likely from untreated river water, drained him further. His shorts tore and eventually fell away. His skin burned under brief sunbreaks and blistered. His legs swelled from infection. He had lost close to 50 pounds. He looked, in the accounts of those who found him, like a person already halfway gone by then. Hope had become something thin and almost embarrassing. People talk about survival as though it is fueled by determination, as though willpower is a resource you can choose to spend. In reality, survival often becomes mechanical. You keep breathing because you are breathing. You keep waking because you woke. Some part of Shock wanted to stop. The thought came at night when shivering shook his muscles into cramps, and the river's roar became the only voice in the world. It would be easy to lie down and let cold finish the work. No more pain, no more hunger, no more uncertainty. What kept him alive, by his later account, was not heroism, but attachment. His mother's face, Freddie's escape, the idea that someone might still be looking, even if the official search had quit. Those thoughts were not logical, but logic wasn't what he needed. He needed a reason to make it through another hour. On the 25th day, a group of volunteers, young people working in the backcountry, carrying tools and backpacks, exhausted from a long day, walked along the river trail, thinking about camp and food and sleep. One of them stopped and listened. Above the river's constant roar, a sound rose that didn't belong, a faint human voice. Help. They dropped packs and ran toward the water, pushing through brush. On a gravel bar, half hidden among alders, they found what they first mistook for debris, a pale, contorted shape curled in on itself. Then the shape moved, and they understood it was a man. Shock lay naked, skeletal, his beard matted with dirt, lips cracked and bleeding. His eyes looked unfocused, clouded by exhaustion and starvation. He whispered that he was hallucinating, that they weren't real, that they were forest spirits. One of the volunteers took off his shirt and covered him. Another produced a tortilla with peanut butter and fed him small pieces, careful not to flood a starving body with food too quickly. Shock chewed and cried, tears streaming down his face in a way that seemed less like emotion than involuntary release. Someone called for help using a satellite transmitter. An hour later, a helicopter hovered overhead, rotors blasting sand into a frenzy. Rescuers descended on ropes, secured Shock in a stretcher, started an IV, and lifted him out of the forest he had crawled through for nearly a month. Hospitals reversed starvation with caution. Shock's body, after weeks of consuming itself, could not simply be refueled like a car. Refeeding syndrome, the potentially fatal complication that occurs when a severely malnourished body receives nutrients too quickly, causes dangerous electrolyte shifts that can trigger heart failure, seizures, and respiratory collapse, making it a well-documented killer of people who survive the wilderness only to die from sudden nutrition. Doctors fed him intravenously at first, monitoring electrolytes, avoiding that trap. On the 4th day, they gave him broth. He later described the taste of hot liquid as something close to impossible, a sensation too gentle to belong in a world that had been only cold and hunger. When Jan Thompson entered the ward on August 31st, she did not recognize her son at first. The person in the bed looked like a stranger wearing Robert's outline. Then he whispered her name. She crossed the room and held him carefully, as if he were made of something fragile and expensive. A week later, the volunteers who had found him visited. Shock hugged them one by one, repeating that they were angels. The word embarrassed him even as he spoke it. But gratitude has its own vocabulary, and sometimes it reaches for myth because ordinary language feels too small. By the end of September, Shock could walk with a cane. He regained weight quickly, 40 pounds within a month, but tendons remained stiff and painful, and his joints felt older than they should have. He had survived, but survival is not a clean victory. It leaves residue. On October 5th, when Shock returned to Ohio, Freddie met him at the car like a projectile, tail wagging so hard his entire body swayed. Shock dropped to his knees and buried his face in the dog's fur. The reunion, in its simplicity, contained everything the wilderness story did not. warmth, certainty, forgiveness. In the interviews that followed, Shock did not present himself as a conqueror. If anything, he sounded chastened. In the United States, an estimated 50,000 search and rescue missions are conducted every year. And the most common reason adults require rescue isn't injury or catastrophe, it's wandering off trail while underprepared, just as Shock had done. He repeated lessons people in the outdoors community have heard so often they become background noise. Always tell someone your route. Carry a map and compass. Don't trust memory. Don't rely on your phone. These warnings are so basic that experienced people tend to treat them as rules for beginners. That is exactly why they fail. Experience does not cancel risk. It often magnifies it by making you careless. Before, Shock had thought of the mountains as a place where he could be free, untracked, self-directed, the master of his own movement. After 30 days of hunger and cold, he understood what the North Cascades have always been. Vast, indifferent, older than any confidence a person brings into them. The range does not punish arrogance. It simply makes arrogance irrelevant. When you look closely at what happened to Robert Shock, the story doesn't hinge on a single catastrophic event. There was no dramatic injury on day one, no avalanche, no broken leg on a knife-edge ridge. There was only a series of small decisions that seemed reasonable in the moment. Packing light because he always packed light. Trusting a remembered route because it had worked before. Pushing forward because turning back felt worse. The mountains did not trap him with malice. They simply accepted each decision and allowed the consequences to unfold. And in the end, the wilderness offered him a narrow, accidental exit, not because it cared whether he lived, but because a few tired volunteers happened to pause long enough to hear a voice that should have been impossible to hear at all.